Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Everyday is Saturday. I'm Matt Stahl, along with my partner, Brad Gatto. And we are going to talk about a concept today that we are really excited to dive into, and that is giving.
Far more than long-term care.
It sounds more exciting than long-term care, yes.
Like we just recorded in the last episode.
We agreed that it went well, and it was interesting.
The listeners are the ones that really matter, I suppose.
We'll see. We'll let someone else be the judge of that.
I did ask one of the employees of Fiat what they thought about it, and it was like one of those, going back to this like story of my wife being surprised my book was okay. She was like, it was actually really good. Like, like the tone of voice again, like, wow, I can't believe that wasn't terrible.
Before we dive in, what have you been up to?
Gosh, man, it's every time you and I have these conversations at the beginning of every episode, I feel like it's all related to sports and our kids, specifically our kids' sports, not you and I playing a bunch of sports or something like that. But for us, we're in transition with that right now. And so the boys actually just tonight start winter baseball, like clinics inside.
Nice.
And basketball has started, practices have started. So coming up, I think in maybe a couple of weeks, like every weekend for the next like 3 months is now a basketball tournament. We're transitioning into that right now, and just transitioning into, cold.
Yes.
I would assume there's people that listen to this that don't live in Minnesota. And so my older sister lives in Florida. They don't have like these weekends of preparation to get ready for the change of a season. You know what I mean? And last weekend, was our whole weekend.
Yep.
Like the entire weekend was devoted to prepping for winter, and it's not done. We still have more to do, but that whole weekend got us part of the way there.
Yeah.
So we're transitioning.
I know it's not your favorite season, so.
It is not. It is my least favorite season by far. Like all the other seasons are like an 8 to 10 out of 10, and this one's like a -4. So, how about you?
All the other way. Sports-wise, it's actually going to be a somewhat quiet little lull here, which doesn't mean that we don't have sports. It just means that official soccer season is wrapped up, lacrosse season is wrapped up, but they still have indoor activities. It's just a little bit more spread out, and we're waiting for the snow. So this is snowboard season for us as soon as the snow flies. So this is actually enjoy this season. I don't know that I'd say it's my favorite, but from a family adventure standpoint, this is one time where we actually come together and do some things together rather than me just watching my kids do activities all the time.
Right. So your family has like a season pass.
Yes.
To go like snowboarding.
That we do.
But because of where we live, it's not like you drive down the street to do that.
No. So there takes some planning, and
everything when you have 4 kids takes planning.
This is true. Yes. The
going to bed, eating,
pretty much anything. Yeah. So we do go a fair amount locally here, and then we always have a trip out west, and then local snowboarding is kind of ruined from that point.
Yeah.
For the remainder of the year. So.
Yeah, I understand that. In fact, as much as I don't like winter, if it's going to be cold, there might as well be snow.
Right.
That is my opinion. Like cold and no snow, that doesn't.
No.
Everything's brown and ugly. I mean, the snow, it like covers up the ugly.
Right.
And it can be fun to play in from time to time.
And I don't enjoy, anything below 10 degrees either. So.
Well, your threshold's much lower than mine. Today when I got up, it was 25, I think, when I went outside, and we had a super windy day here yesterday. I don't know how fast or, how the miles per hour. I have no idea how fast the wind was blowing. I just know it was fast. And I lost my trash can.
Oh, just all together.
It's gone. 90-gallon trash can. And now I feel really bad because my wife was gone all weekend. So the kids were gone, the wife was gone. I had the house to myself. When she comes home, the house should be in order, right? Like it.
Yeah.
I have no excuse.
Yeah,
I have none. I have none excuse. And the trash came on Friday, so it's been empty out in the cul-de-sac since Friday, and it was just yesterday that it got super windy. And so now, the wind basically told on me. Like he didn't bring the trash can in for 2 straight days, and so it blew away. So I'm walking around outside like a very not smart person this morning in 25-degree weather, trying to find a 90-gallon trash can. I can't find it. Like I got Auntie-M kind of situation yesterday.
Raccoons.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go with something because I thought, the house does look pretty good, So I thought, okay, she's not. Where's the trash can? Well, I left it on the curb for 2 straight days.
Whoops.
All right, let's get into this. We're going to talk about giving today, and before we jump into the obvious part of what we're going to talk about, because 2 financial advisors talking about giving, at least it seems obvious to me. We're going to talk about some gifting strategies and the most efficient way to give. But before we dive into that, that's kind of the matter of the mind, right? When it comes to giving and what's the most efficient way to do it. But you and I both agree, we were just talking about this before we started the episode, is giving really doesn't start as a matter of the mind, right? It starts as a matter of the heart, right? We give hopefully because your heart tells you to give and you feel called to that in some way, shape, or form, or there's some sort of, family members that you care about that you want to give to, or, organizations or charities or whatever. And so before we get into the practical side of it, just talk to me a little bit, Matt, about what giving means to you and why you think this is going to be a fun topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked about in the past values as individuals and values as a company, and how this is something that's always come up. Yep. And giving can encompass, it can be financial, it can be time, it can be, there's all sorts of different things. But when we think in terms of the world that we live in, and often we're talking about money, it's one area we can have a whole lot of impact. And I'm a big Tony Robbins fan. I'm sure most people have heard of him. And there's one story that's always stuck with me, and just the impact of, growing up, his family didn't have a lot of money. And when I think he was 12 years old, and they had a stranger show up at their door and gave them Thanksgiving dinner. And that was just a momentous shift in his life. And from that point forward, and if you know who he is, you know what he's done. I mean, had a gigantic impact. I just think it's fascinating to think about one simple gesture from one person can set that whole thing off. And we have so many opportunities every day to do that and to make a gigantic impact when it really might not be that big of an ask from our side. Yeah. So I think it's just such an important thing to think about. And selfishly, there's all sorts of science that says you're going to get more satisfaction out of giving something to someone. I never believed that when I was younger. It wasn't until you got a bit more mature, but there's so much return that comes from that, the impact that you can have on someone else's life, whether it's, a church, a charity, an individual, but also the emotional return you get on that is also, it's a win-win-win, I guess is the way I look at it. You have anything to add to that? Yeah.
Well, actually what I was thinking about when you were talking is we're both parents, right? And I'm sure a lot of the people listening to this podcast are parents, or whether you have adult kids that are moved out of the house or you've got young kids at home, but that's what I was thinking of, is this idea that as a child, because we all have parents, whether you have any kids or not, we all have parents, and how as an adult now at 40 years old, how thankful I am for a lot of the things that my parents did and how much time, energy, and effort it takes to raise kids and all that kind of stuff. But my parents, I'm sure, I've not asked them this question, but I feel this way, got far more out of, although that's a completely selfless act to raise children and how much work goes into it and how crazy it is in the day-to-day. Sometimes parents would look back on it and on the whole be like, you know what, it was, I got far more out of it than you did. It meant more to me than it meant to you, and how much your kids mean to you. And so that's the ultimate generosity, right? Of being selfless. Now we're going to talk about the money aspect of it specifically today, but generosity can come in a lot of forms. It can come through your time, through your talents, through your money, and some other ways. But the bottom line is, anytime you step outside of yourself and you give of a resource that you have, usually it's that old adage of, it means more to you than it means to them, or that you're going to get, I get more out of this than you got out of it, or that it meant to you, or whatever it may be. So, I talk about this in my book too. There's a chapter on giving, and you made the comment of, how it can kind of have this long impact. The analogy I use in the book, and I just want to bring it up here if you've not had a chance to read the book or are not a reader. It was this trip that we made we were up north in northern Minnesota. And if you're unfamiliar, the headwaters, or the starting point for the Mississippi River, is actually in the state of Minnesota, in northern Minnesota. Itasca, I think, is Yep. Yeah, I think that's the name of the town. It's right outside of Itasca. And so we were up in that area and somebody said, hey, that's where the headwaters are, blah, 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 blah. I got super excited. I was like, oh man, like this is going to be amazing. Like to get to see where the Mississippi River starts, and it's like, it's the river in the United States, one of the biggest rivers in the world. Yeah, we're going to go check this out. And it was very underwhelming. It's like a puddle. It's like this little, it's not even, you can't even call it, it's not a lake. It's like a pond, like a little pond.
Yeah.
And it looks like nothing. It's like this little, it's moving. The water's moving away from the pond, but it's babbling.
Yeah.
It's like a babbling brook.
Babbling brook.
Kind of thing. And it just really hit me. I was like, man, this is crazy that it starts out as this. And then by the time you get down to the Twin Cities, which is not even a tenth of the way through its 2,000-mile journey, it is a raging, crazy river.
Yeah.
Like it is massive, and it powers. I mean, the city was built here because it powered, it's what created the power. And for a lot of the plants that are still downtown, I think Pillsbury was down there and some other ones like the originals, right? But I think of giving that way. It starts off, even if you're giving of your time or your money, like it can start very, very small, but it can have this massive impact down the line. And that Tony Robbins story is a great example of that. Somebody gave to them, and then what that meant to them, their generosity meant to him, that it created, it instilled in him something that's still impacting him to this day. Money aside, I can think of multiple people that I've encountered in my life that have given me their time or their energy or sometimes their money, and how much that's meant to me as well. And I'm sure everybody listening to this podcast can think of a time in their life where somebody's generosity meant something to them. And so it's absolutely a matter of the heart. It's really important to us. One of the coolest parts about our job is we get an opportunity to help people live generously. And again, before we kind of get into the super nerdy financial side of this and how to do it efficiently, and I bring this up in the book too, but I think the number one reason that holds people back from being generous is fear.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Of just not, well, if I give it to you, then I don't have it. And if I don't know if I need it yet or not. And so I need to kind of hold that back and see if I need it. And then if later down the line I don't, then maybe I can be generous with my money or with my time or whatever it may be. And that's one of the best parts about the planning that we do, is we can remove a lot of that fear by answering a lot of the unknown questions and creating boundaries and freedom inside of those boundaries for families that we work with. And that frees them up.
Right. Yeah.
To be able to do what I would contend the average human's heart desires to do anyway, which is be generous.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of add to that a bit more, I think we all have our own set of beliefs, but I personally happen to believe most people are good people.
Yep.
There's probably a few exceptions out there where things aren't wired correctly somewhere, but
doesn't mean the person's not good.
Right.
It just means there's
So there's something else. So
yeah.
I think we all want to do that. It's all, that's part of who we are. I think that the world that we live in has, not necessarily intentionally, but it is easy to forget that.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the world we live in. Everything's instantly at our fingertips. You can go order something online. It shows up at your door. I ordered something yesterday and it showed up at 6:30 a.m. this morning. Like what? What the heck?
I've ordered stuff at Fiat at 10 a.m. and it shows up by 1 p.m.
Yeah, it's crazy. So we are in this world where it's really easy to get to me.
Yeah.
Because we have so many things at our fingertips. And it's not that we don't have those intentions that we want to do good things, but sometimes it takes a little reminder.
Yeah.
And so I think getting into the planning side of things, it does all come back to that. Like that, I feel like that's where we really struck a chord when you and I kind of sat back and figured out like, what issue are we actually trying to solve for people here? Mm-hmm. It's not, sure, there's this long list of a good diversified portfolio, the right amount of insurance and But when we really kind of hit the nail on the head and said, we can teach people how to spend their money and have peace of mind around that, and know they're doing everything in their power, and to give them that freedom to feel like, hey, we are enough. We have enough. We feel confidence in that. We understand it. And so now we can start looking beyond ourselves and see the kind of impact that we can have.
Yeah. So it is It is spending,
right?
Spending money and having fun, which is just on other people.
It might be the best return you get on any of your money.
Best ROI.
Yes.
Return on investment. And now we transition to the nerdy stuff. That was a great transition moment. Yeah. Anyway, you and I could banter about this for way too long for one podcast episode, because I know what it means to us, and we've had plenty of conversations about this. But let's get into some practical advice or steps or things to be thinking about or cognizant about. And we decided to kind of delineate between gifting while you're alive versus gifting after you pass away.
Yep.
And so we're going to kind of tackle the gifting while you're alive and some things to be cognizant of first, and then we'll transition into possibly how to do that beyond just your time here on Earth.
Yeah. So I think from a framework standpoint, when we really get into the meat and potatoes of everything, where it's first and foremost from a planning perspective, we figure out, okay, do we have enough? What kind of lifestyle are we going to focus on? And then we come to a point where we realize, okay, usually we have enough. We know where we're going to be. So now we can start to work that backwards. Mm-hmm. And in that conversation, we say, do you want to leave money to your children?
Yeah.
Do you have a church or a charity that means something to you? So that's kind of the first questions that we go through and answer are, what are those things that mean the most to us?
Yeah.
Oftentimes people have that right off the top of their head. Sometimes it takes a little more thought. And then from there,
when I always tell, just to add to that, I always tell people to like dream big. Like if money, if you don't limit yourself in this brain exercise of who do you want to give to and what kind of legacy do you want to leave, and whether again while you're alive or after you pass away, is to start off with like that. They call it the big, hairy, audacious goal, the BHAG, right? Like start there.
Yep.
And then possibly work backwards. And so we're going to come back to that. But welcome to my brain. You mentioned at the beginning of what you said, because I'm going to derail us here for just a second, the meat and potatoes of this. Do you think that statement works anywhere outside the Midwest? Do you think that if somebody in the East Coast or West Coast is listening to this, that they get even what that means? Like as an Iowa boy raised in Iowa, I 100% know. I mean, we didn't have a dinner without meat and potatoes.
Right.
There was always a starch, a potato, and it was, now today you can have yams and sweet. There was none of that. It was a potato. It was a white potato. Like it was like when you said it, that's all I thought of. It was like, I wonder how well that works these days. Like, especially with, the popularity of vegetables these days.
I love vegetables.
Well, so do I, but anyway, welcome to some of my weirdness. That's what I got stuck on of all the things you said. I was like, I wonder if anybody doesn't understand what we mean by that.
I bet you some East Coast would be like the lobster and the butter.
Something like that. Careful. Anyway.
Out west, it would be the salmon and the.
Really?
I don't know.
Northwest, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know. Just there you go. Meat and potatoes, the primary, components. At least, again, if you're raised in rural Iowa like I was, that was,
I was raised in the big city. So.
You for sure, like vegetables were optional, but every meal had meat and potato.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So coming back, you start off with what are the things that are important to you. You kind of build that big, hairy, audacious goal of like, this is what I would really, really like to do. And then you can begin by kind of working backwards from that. But Matt, it is, once you figure out what you want to give to and what you really like to do, what are kind of the next steps to trying to be efficient as it relates to giving? What are some of the things you need to be cognizant of?
Yeah. So one of the most simple things is every year there's a gift exemption. Mm-hmm. So a certain amount of money that you can give to others.
So you could give money to me?
So I could give money to you.
Okay. Yeah. And is there a tax impact to that?
So the tax impact piece of it would be that person would not be taxed on that gift. So, and it wouldn't count against our lifetime exemption, which we'll get to as we.
Yeah, that may not mean anything to you right this second. But the bottom line is you can give money like person to person. Like if you just wanted to give me money as a non-taxable event.
Yep.
Right. Now, the person giving the money needs to be cognizant of how much they're giving. And if that's going to dip into this exclusion that you mentioned, which we'll talk more about later, but that exclusion matters. You need to pay attention to it because you can gift so much money every single year. We all have a certain pile of money that we can give away before the IRS steps in and says, we're going to start taxing your gifts.
Right.
So, and whatever you don't give away ends up getting gifted when you die. And we all have this exemption, this amount that we get to use up that we don't have to pay this death tax on, or estate tax. And so every year you can gift without touching that exemption.
Yep.
There's like this, it's an inflation adjusted amount that you get to give. But the bottom line is, so you need to be thinking about how much you're giving so that you don't go over that. And if you do go over that, make sure you're planning for it. And the amount, I think in 2022 is like $16,000.
$16,000.
So I could give you $16,000 and it doesn't hit your taxes and it doesn't take up any of that exclusion that I have at my death to avoid estate or death tax. Right. But there's other ways to get around that too. So from a practical sense, you can gift without even dipping into that exclusion at all, that annual exclusion of $16,000 by like paying somebody else's bills,
right?
Like medical bills or something like that. If you've got a child, an adult child or a brother or sister, something like that you want to help them out, and you're worried about gifting above and beyond that amount, you can do things like that. With grandkids, you can be more aggressive about it. If it's like for a 529 plan, you can gift up to, I think, $80,000 in a year without it hitting the exemption, even though it's way above 16.
Yep.
So there are some exceptions to that rule and ways to kind of get around it. And so if you're going to do annual gifting while you're alive, the first thing you just need to be aware of is how much you're going to give, and is that going to affect my taxes, or is it going to affect their taxes or my future taxes and things like an estate tax or a death tax? And then is there a more efficient way to think about this, and should I be giving them, through because if you're gifting for the purpose of paying a bill or something like that, maybe you should just pay the bill directly.
Right. Yep. So that would be kind of, and I think of this as in stages. So that would be someone that's looking at this on an annual basis. That's usually gifting to a family member. Is usually what we see. Now, as we transition into RMDs, or required minimum distributions, that kind of takes us down a different path altogether. And
before we go there, I guess another point I should bring up, because we get this question a lot, is, like if I wanted to gift you $16,000 without touching my lifetime exemption, I can do that. And again, non-taxable for either one of us. But my wife could also gift you $16,000.
Right.
So technically, I could get you $32,000 without any tax impact on either side.
Yep.
And so if you're thinking about this from the perspective of your adult children, if you're married, you can give 16, your spouse can give 16 to your son or daughter. And if they're married, you can do that again to their spouse.
Right.
So really, a married couple, mom and dad, could give $64,000 to a married couple, son and daughter, for like the down payment on a house. And you're just using up 4 different exclusions.
Yep. Yeah.
So again, there's ways to get, to be creative about it, to try to move a little bit more money. If it's help them start a business, I want to help them down payment on a home or something like that. And so if you're unfamiliar with some of those rules and you have questions around, gifting to family members and stuff, it's definitely something that we can help you out with.
Yeah. I guess before we transition to the required minimum distributions, because that's something where that kind of forces our hand at starting to think about.
Well, yeah, and that's not gifting to family anymore, right?
Right. But would be something before would be like a donor advised fund, would be something else where we'd see that kind of take place before we're transition to that.
Yeah. So in the world of giving to a nonprofit, we all know, at least most of us probably know, that you can gift to a nonprofit and be able to quote unquote write it off on your taxes. Right now, we live in this interesting time, this Tax Cuts and Job Act, where our standard deduction is so big that for the vast majority of people, the first amount that you give to a nonprofit is not tax deductible because it's still within your standard deduction.
Yep.
And in most cases, it's different for everybody, Matt, but I see it a lot where it's around the first like 10 grand. Doesn't really mean anything,
right?
Because you get the standard deduction anyway. And so you got to be cognizant of that. And if you're in that world, maybe there's a more creative way to do it. But when you start thinking about this idea of gifting to charities or nonprofits, adding in the tax impact, it's a matter of the heart, right? We're doing it because we think but if we can get a tax write-off for it, we want to be able to do that. And so things like donor advised funds, QCDs, and even lump giving are some strategies that you can employ to try to not just have that lifetime impact that we talked about with being able to be generous with your money, but also on your end, kind of get that tax break. And so the simplest of those, I think, is probably the lump giving, and then the donor advised fund, we can talk about it, and then RMDs. So, lump giving is something that a lot of the families we work with take advantage of. And so if you're the type of person that wants to give $1,000 or $10,000 a year, something like that, to a specific charity, whether it's your church or it's, the animal shelter or whatever it may be, maybe instead of giving 10 grand a year, you give 20 grand every other year.
Yeah. Yep.
So that your gifting gets you through the standard deduction and then into itemized deductions and get deeper into itemized deductions so that you can write off the vast majority of that gift. Whereas if you just gave 10 grand every year, it might be in your situation that you don't get to write any of that off.
Right.
And so being strategic about it, the timing of it is probably the simplest way to try to plan. Like I said, we have a lot of families that do that. What you mentioned earlier is the donor advised fund. The donor advised fund is you can basically set money aside. So if you, again, just keep things simple. Let's just say you're giving 10 grand a year to a charity and you've just done it for a long time. And that's your plan moving forward. I'm just going to give 10 grand every year to this particular charity. So if you think about it, over the next 10 years, you're going to give 100 grand. Well, you can basically take that whole 100 grand, set it aside today, take the entire write-off or deduction for that today, put it in a separate account, and then use that account to fund that same $10,000 check every single year, but kind of lump in all the write-off side of it into 1 year.
Yeah. And that would be an example where, say you're a business owner and you have a unusually profitable year that's not typical. That would be something that would make sense in that kind of scenario where, you want to give the money and it's a win-win from that standpoint. And the other piece that I wanted to add to that is sometimes it makes sense to think about what we're actually gifting as opposed to just cash. Sometimes you can gift appreciated stock. And rather than, if I held on to a particular stock for a long period of time and there's a lot of capital gains built up in there, if I gift that to a charity or some other organization, it actually is beneficial because that capital gains tax no longer exists.
They don't have to pay the bill.
They don't have to pay the bill, and you're not paying the bill. So
and going back to the point you made about the donor advised fund, if you're still in your working years and you've own a business, you have this unreasonably large income, good problem to have, right? And so you choose to do that. For retirees, where it comes in a lot for us in our planning is with Roth conversions. So in a year where we're purposely going to convert a significant amount of money, 100 grand, 200 grand, 300 grand to a Roth IRA or something like that, we can also use that year to fund your DAF or your donor advised fund to offset that conversion because it's money that you're planning on giving anyway.
Right.
But you got to be careful because if it's not money you're planning on giving anyway, and you think, well, I may want to give this money, it's not revocable. Right. Once it goes in there into that donor advised fund, it has to come back out into a charity's hands. You can't change your mind down the line and kind of take that money back into your life. So, but you can put it in there, and like in my example, you put 100 grand in today and you're going to get 10 grand a year. You could even, you can invest the money the same as it was if it was just sitting in your investment account or something like that. And so there's just some creative ways that you can be strategic about the timing in which you give, especially if it's giving you're doing anyway. And then you mentioned RMDs as the other option here.
Yeah. So one thing we often see less and less with the people that are, I would say, coming to us now, because there's a lot more awareness, or I feel like we've built more awareness around that. But oftentimes what we'd see is someone come in, a couple that's 68, and they may feel like they have a pretty good grasp on their tax picture, not thinking about the fact that they have this chunk of money sitting in a pre-tax IRA, and when they turn 72, they're gonna be required to take a pretty big chunk of money out, coming up. And sometimes that's kind of a blind side to realize, oh my gosh, that's a big chunk of money. That's going to change their tax picture altogether. And I feel like that's another stage of where thinking about the giving, that kind of prompts us to start thinking about this a bit more strategically. And that would be, you mentioned QCDs, so a qualified charitable distribution in that scenario.
I just want to make sure the listeners understand what you're talking about, because RMDs, required minimum distributions, is just a fancy way to say all of your qualified retirement accounts, your IRAs, 401ks, 403bs, all your pre-tax accounts that you're able to save on a tax-deferred basis. The IRS forces you to start distributing that money back out of those accounts at the age of 72 so that you have to pay the tax bill. So it's a requirement, and there's a minimum amount every year that you have to pull out.
And it's distribution.
And it's a distribution. There you go. And so when that happens, you're right. That actually, the reason that's a triggering event a lot of times, Matt, is because if that's a surprise to you at 72 that is coming, it's usually because you're not pulling any money out of your IRAs.
Right.
We see this all the time. People in their, they retire, and then all the way through their 60s, they pull nothing out of their IRAs and they just kind of let it bake. And And then they get to 72 and the IRS goes, hey, wait a minute, you have to start pulling it out. And so now that's going to hit your 1040 and add more taxable income into your life. And of course, that can set off this cascading of events of, problems from a tax perspective, maybe not, but it can. And that's usually when people realize, maybe I'm not going to spend all this money,
Right.
because it's been years of it just sitting there. I've had access to it since I was 59 and a half when the IRS took away the penalty for, early distribution. Now it's been 12 and a half years and I haven't done anything with it.
Yep.
And so that's usually mentally where a lot of times where people flip and they go, okay, I can get comfortable with the idea of starting to give this away. But I wouldn't say the IRS is nice, but one of the nice parts about an RMD is you can gift an RMD direct to charity. In other words, instead of taking the distribution from the IRA that they require of you and putting it into your checking account, and then taking that money from your checking account and gifting it to a charity, the problem you're going to run into there is exactly what we talked about before, is maybe that gift doesn't exceed your standard deduction. So you're really not going to get any tax write-off for it. It's not going to help you from a tax perspective. But you can skip that step of going to your checking account. You can take money directly from your IRA, gift it straight to a charity, have it satisfy the requirement of that distribution you have to take, and be a non-taxable event to you and actually to the charity as well.
Right. Yep.
You mentioned age 72, right? That's when the RMDs kick in. Now, it used to be 70 and a half. A couple of years ago, they changed it. 70 and a half, you had to start taking the RMDs. Now it's 72. And I've had a lot of people ask, well, Brad, aren't they changing that too? Well, there is a bill out there to possibly change RMDs to age 75. Hasn't passed yet. Today it's 72. What's interesting is when it was 70 and a half a couple of years ago, it was at that point that you could also do these qualified charitable distributions, or QCDs, which is what I just got done explaining, skipping your checking account, giving the money direct to charity. QCD, qualified charitable distribution. Well, when they changed the RMD age to 72, they did not change the QCD age. So even before your RMDs start, at the year you turn 70 and a half, you can still QCD. So there's this weird, sometimes 2 tax year gap, depending on when you turn, when your birthday is. But for sure, for everybody, at least a 1 tax year gap between when you can start QCDing out of IRAs before the RMD actually kicks in.
You learn something new every day.
Arbitrage, some people call that.
fancy lingo. So I'd say that's kind of thinking about giving while you're alive. And if you're not going to spend all the money that you have, you are going to end up giving it at some point when you're no longer here. So that would, I would say that would transition us to thinking about, if we're not proactive and doing that while we're alive, it is going to go somewhere.
Yep.
So
they've done, I joke about this all the time. It's one of the kind of financial dad jokes that I have, is that they've done, there's white paper after white paper after white paper that you can read. And they've done all these studies and they've all come to the same conclusion. And that is that you can't take it with you. It's going to go somewhere, not with you. So once you pass away, you have your estate, and your estate is comprised of not just your physical assets and everything that you own, but also all of your investable assets, your cash and everything else. And that creates your
life insurance
estate.
Yep.
Right. And you're like, if you have life insurance, death benefits, like everything that you can think of that, financially, any benefits that come from things like insurance, the physical property, the invested assets, all of it, that creates when you hear that term estate, that's what creates your estate. And as we mentioned before, everybody gets an exemption, or they get a certain amount for their estate that can go to anybody else without paying a death tax or an estate tax. Now, I want to be very clear. This is not, because we talked about giving, 401k and IRA money, and how if you pass that on, they have to pay the tax bill. That's ordinary income taxes. There's no getting out of that, right? If you pass on 401k assets, IRA assets, things like that, the next generation is going to have to pay the ordinary income tax on that. And I'm not talking about, non-qualified money and the step up in basis and possible gains there. And I'm talking about estate taxes or death taxes. It's a different tax.
Yep.
And so it's possible that you pass on an IRA to somebody and they have to pay the ordinary income tax on that. And then on top of that, possibly the estate has to pay an estate tax as well.
Right.
Now, everybody gets an exemption, and the exemption before you have to start paying this additional tax, this death tax, is how much?
For 2022 is $12.06 million. So
per spouse.
That's for a couple. correct?
Nope, that's per spouse.
That's per spouse.
Per spouse.
Yeah.
So in 2022, it's over 24 million that you get to use up on a federal level.
Yes.
That's the federal estate tax exclusion. Very fancy there. Every state, because we have to pay state taxes too, has an exemption as well. I don't have all 50 states memorized. I don't know where you're listening to this. We happen to be recording in the state of Minnesota. For 2021, it was 3 million. I don't know if there was a little bit of an inflation adjustment for 2022.
I think there's only 13 states that actually charge a state estate tax.
Well, we live in Minnesota, so obviously
Minnesota's one of those. Yes, of course.
Yeah, some states have them, some don't. Just like some states tax Social Security on a state level, some don't. We also do that here.
Yeah.
In the state of Minnesota, it's 3 million. But on a federal level, you get today over 24 million. You're a state, and we defined what a state means earlier. Before you'll have to worry about this potential for a death tax or an estate tax, but it hasn't always been 12 million.
Has not, and this was something I was excited to dig into. And going back to 2008, that number was $2 million.
So it's grown a tiny bit,
just a bit.
Yep.
So if you look back, in 2003, it was $1 million. So
20 years ago, basically, it was $1 million. Today, it's $12 million.
So we've seen that grow pretty substantially, and there was a pretty significant bump in 2018. So that was part of
the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
Yeah. Yep. So that actually jumped from about 5.5 million up to just over 11.
Just a tiny jump.
Just a tiny jump.
But as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expires, we've talked a lot about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in our podcast. We talk about it all the time at Fiat. We're living in this weird time. And on a person, there's a bunch of provisions that are going to expire in the tax code in 2025. And in 2026, we'll go back to kind of what it used to be. And so this exemption or this bubble is going to go from over 12 million back down to that kind of 5 million range.
Yep. Around 5.5 million.
Of course, they could change something between now and then. They could extend the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and, all that kind of stuff. But as the law states today, the amount you get to pass on without paying the death tax is going down significantly in 2026.
Yep. And the estate tax it's hovered around 40%. If you go back to the 90s, the highest rate was about 55%. So
yeah, so like ordinary income tax brackets, there's multiple brackets, right? You start at 10, the highest bracket's 37. With estate taxes, it's the same, but the first bracket is 40.
Yeah.
Jeez. So it gets pretty expensive pretty quick. So again, it's a very big exemption right now. And so there's a lot of people listening that are going to be like, I don't have to worry about this. I'm not going to have a $25 million estate. No big deal. But go back and listen to, actually, I think it's the next episode that we're recording on Psychology Money, the compounding. Isn't that the next episode?
I think it is.
Oh, you're going to stay tuned. You don't have to go back and listen. You have to stay tuned because we're going to talk about compound interest and how crazy it gets at late in life. So a lot of people's estates end up significantly larger than they think they're going to because of the way compounding interest works in time. But even more importantly, the exemption's going down. And there have been, Congress has tried to pass, or at least showed their hand and said, there's some politicians that are trying to get it down to $1 million per person before that tax kicks in. And so there are ways, though, to have $100 million estate, so to speak, or $100 million in your estate while you're alive between your investable assets and your physical property and all that stuff, and still avoid death taxes.
Yep.
Even though the exemption is tens of millions of dollars below what your estate is worth. And so when it comes to gifting, quote unquote, after you pass away, this is really when a estate planning attorney is going to be extremely valuable. But there are strategies to basically still be able to live on the assets that you have, but not control them. Right. Where if they're out of your control, you kind of remove them from your control, then technically you don't own them. And if you don't own them, then again, technically it's not part of your estate. It almost sounds like a loophole, but the bottom line is there's a lot of different types of trusts that can be used to allow you to continue to use the assets while you're alive, but then have them not count towards your estate at death, therefore avoiding some of these pretty egregious taxes.
Yeah, I feel as that, when you start to dig into some of these legacy families, this is where you'll see a lot of that generational wealth that just continues to pass on and compound. And so there's several different types of trusts. And as you dig into that, you realize there's so many different avenues and different directions you can go. It's a bit overwhelming.
Yeah, yes, we were kind of laughing about this before we started recording because the acronyms are great too. There's slats and grats and clats and all these different types of trusts and ILETs where you can have assets and then remove them from your estate. But we're not going to get all nerdy on that. The bottom line is this: just understand that it is very possible to have a voice from the grave. It is very possible, as far as giving is concerned, to also be able to remove those assets from your estate. And so if it sounds interesting to you at all, or if you're worried about your estate going beyond future exemptions, because we know they're going down, right? In your estate, again, all physical assets, all investable assets, all possible death benefit from life insurance, if all that's going to add up to, any significant amount of money, then having the conversation of what do I want to do with this at death? What do I want it to look like? And how much control do I want to have? And then also how much privacy do I want to have? I mean, for me personally, Matt, with young kids at home, I have a trust for my wife and I, and a big piece of it has to do with the privacy of it.
Right.
Because
that's a great point.
I don't love the idea of my estate going through probate. Now we're getting into a kind of estate planning podcast here, but I just like the privacy of it. So there's additional or ancillary benefits.
Actually, let's talk about that just real quick. So when you say that, what you mean by that is if you didn't have a trust in place and it did go through probate, that's actually public knowledge that
it's all anybody can see probate records.
Right. And in that scenario, if this isn't very fun to talk about, gosh. So
you brought it up.
If Brad and Christy die in a plane crash and
thanks.
I told you it wasn't fun.
7 billion people, you picked me.
It's a really good example. You just talked about your estate.
I know.
So Liam and Hudson, if you didn't have that planning in place, the unfortunate piece of that is that becomes public knowledge. And now that opens them up to predatory, offers and people speaking them out. So that's what Brad's talking about when he says, keep it public. Is in that scenario, that would not be public knowledge. So,
right. The trust doesn't go to the public and nobody knows what my estate is worth or what assets I had and when my kids inherit that stuff and all that kind of things. And so that's going to avoid any potential predatory, or ambulance chaser type people knowing that my minor children end up with some assets. And then when they turn 18, get this and get the, that kind of deal. So, but back to the giving side of it, it's just important to know that you absolutely, regardless of what the size of your estate, you can avoid estate taxes if proper planning is done. And I would argue even more importantly to that, you can create generational wealth and have a voice of what that looks like decades, generations after you pass away. And that's a really cool thought or really cool concept if the planning is done correctly. Now, you and I are not estate planning attorneys. I want to get that out there again. And so when it comes to actually drafting these legal documents it takes to get this kind of stuff done, we can't do that here at Fiat. We need an estate planning attorney to do that. But working in conjunction with them, of all the planning that we're doing with the families that we work with, and then bringing an estate planning attorney in and kind of putting it gets really cool and really fun when you put all this together, knowing that everything you have and everything you worked for, that you have the opportunity to gift while you're alive. And creating those opportunities, but then on top of that, knowing that you're going to possibly have the opportunity to leave that type of legacy. Yeah, because we always worry about that. It's in the back of everybody's mind. Right. Like when I pass away, how am I going to be remembered, and who's going to remember me, and that kind of stuff.
You asked me a question earlier about we like to tell stories. We've both been in the business for a long time. Stories are just impactful and helpful, I think. And I didn't actually have a story that came to mind, but when you brought that up, I do have a good story that I think is really helpful in just the communication side of things. Yeah. So one of the coolest experiences I've ever had is actually had a client. We planned what we called it a family meeting. And, we don't like the word meeting around here because it sounds so stuffy, but it was one of the better experiences I've ever had just to get everyone on the same page. So his wife had passed away unexpectedly and he was transitioned to retirement. He had several kids. And so we decided to rent a house, grab dinner, and I went and got together with all of them. And we just talked through the whole estate plan. So everyone's on the same page and they understand everything. And that was a really cool experience and something that I would encourage people to do. So everybody knows that they're on the same page and what the values are and which direction they're heading. And it also gives them an opportunity to kind of voice any concerns.
Yep.
So when you're talking about bringing in an estate planning attorney, that's kind of just putting that's the, dotting the I and crossing the T. The real important conversation.
It's the meat and potatoes.
It's the meat and potatoes. Yeah. It's the salmon and spinach. It's the lobster and but it's really the conversation leading up to that. And what do you want to accomplish and why? And now you can start to, plug in these different strategies from that standpoint.
Yeah. I actually remember when you did that, and I know exactly what you're talking about. And that's a really cool story. At this point, Matt, I think we can probably kind of wrap up here, but I guess the call to action here for people is, I think you mentioned this earlier. I believe in the good of all humans. And I believe that in everybody's heart of hearts, generosity is in there somewhere. And it may be cloaked by your own wants and desires sometimes, because we talked about that. We live in this society where everything's just available to us. But I would say that the number one thing that kind of squashes that in us is fear of not knowing if we've got enough. And so if that's something, that if you relate to that, I would encourage you to, whether it's, Fiat or somebody else, just what that tells me is the amount of planning that has been done in your life probably just isn't enough to give you the freedom and to take that fear away so that you can give the way that you want to give, whether it's to your kids today while you're alive, or it's, again, being more meaningful about removing assets from your estate to give them at death or whatever it may be. And so that's kind of the first kind of challenge I have. And then the second one is, and I say this a lot to the families we work with, it's a lot more fun to give while you're alive than it is after you die, because you get to watch the seeds that you planted and how they get to grow. And so selfishly, that's fun, And one of my greatest desires in life, and specifically in this job, is to be able to watch the families we work with watch that. Watch the seeds that they plant grow, because we kind of have that second layer of, what's the language I'm looking for? We're not the person doing the giving, but we get to kind of sit back and watch it and be a part of it.
Spectator.
Yeah, we're a spectator in the deal. It's just super fun. And so whether you're giving a little amount now or none, or you're giving a ton already, this is one of the funnest conversations we can have with you. And so if we haven't had this conversation in a while and you already work with us, let's talk about it again. If you're somebody that it doesn't work with us and you're not having these types of super fun conversations with your advisor on your own, if you're a DIYer, I would actually really love to have 100 of these conversations every month, where it's just structured around how do I take what I have and make an impact to the world around me. Again, could be something as direct as my kids or grandkids or some bigger type of organization, but just make sure that you've thought through it, because we talk about this all the time too. Like, you're gonna get to the end of life and you're gonna be like, gosh, what would I have done differently? And this is also a common theme for people, is I would have been more generous with my time, my money, the resources that I had access to.
Absolutely. That was fun.
It was fun. It's always fun.
It is fun.
Every day is Saturday.
That's right. You were very surprised by how much fun we had talking about long-term care.
I should have said this at the beginning when you said, what have you been up to lately? My dad actually just retired. His last day of work was on Friday. Nice. And so I got to my every day is Saturday being, it's always fun helping the families that we serve, get to outcomes that they want in life, whether it's something like retirement or it's this giving type conversation or whatever it may be. But it's obviously a little bit more personal one to your dad.
Oh yeah.
And so super fun to be a part. I was calling him every day. It's your last Monday. It's your last Tuesday. It's your last Wednesday at work. That whole deal, to get to talk to him on Friday when we walked out the door. This stuff just is fun. It gets super nerdy sometimes and we get down to the numbers sometimes, but it's just fun because your money impacts every area of your life. And if you want to live an everyday Saturday lifestyle, you got to set up these boundaries for yourself so you can have freedom inside of what you're doing. So, anyway, with that said, thanks for listening to another episode of Every Day is Saturday. We hope you enjoyed this episode, especially for something that's so kind of personal for Matt and I. That said, if you have not yet subscribed to the podcast, we'd ask you to do so. It's very easy. Just click a button. All that really means is that you're just going to be notified when new episodes come out so that if you haven't figured out the cadence already, it's every other Wednesday. We come out with new episodes, but subscribe, share with your families and friends, anybody that is a podcast listener or maybe a non-podcast listener. And Every Day is Saturday is the first podcast they ever listened to.
Yeah.
I would love to know those stories. And lastly, last ask, if any episode we've ever recorded has made an impact for you or you've shared it, I'd love to hear those stories as well. So please share those. All of our contact information, whether you want to figure out how to email us or call us is on our website, fiatwm.com. You can check us out there. That said, thanks for listening and join us next Saturday. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you for listening to Every Day is Saturday. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Fiat Wealth Management. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.